questions arise.
Are the stories in the Bible true?
What if I told you that there are hundreds of confirming witnesses,
which give intricate detail to the stories in the Bible?
Have you ever found yourself deep in the rabbit hole with questions that no one seemed to have the answers to?
Check out swpcalendar.com to see when to join us for our next Ask Me Anything series with author and researcher Gary Wayne, as he sheds light on the mysteries which have us all searching together. Hello and welcome everybody. It's awesome to see you all tonight. I'm your host Justin James Garcia, and I'm joined by my dear brother, author and researcher Gary Wayne. I'm so excited to continue our series of Ask Me Anything with Brother Gary. This is our 35th episode, and I'm looking forward to getting to the pre-made list tonight. We always start with a pre-made list of 14 questions, and then we will get into some live questions for everybody that is joining in over at the YouTube live stream. We are monitoring the chat over there on youtube.com/ZenGarcia. And Facts Not Fiction and MJM got your questions already. The first two questions on the list for the live questions tonight. So prayerfully, we'll get through these, and I'm really excited to hear Brother Gary's answers to all of these really awesome questions. So let's go ahead and bring on Gary. How are you doing tonight, sir?
Doing very well, and so happy to be back again and to, talk about things that people want to talk about and want to know about. So that's why I love this show, and I have to admit the questions are always challenging, both the pre-submitted ones and the ones that come in out of the chat. But it's about all of us sort of journeying on this quest and trying to learn. So it's about where you're at and where everybody else is at. So we try and sort of bring everybody along in that in terms of how we answer the questions, and then hopefully shed some light on some things and connect some dots. So really, again, looking forward to tonight's set of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we get into the questions for tonight, we know you have written a very awesome book, your first book, and you are working on another book, but that first book, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, that is a work of art, and it's just such a great treasure trove of information. Could you let people know where they could read more about that and find out some more information, where they could possibly get a copy for themselves?
Yeah, the best place to go is to my website, and it's the www.genesis6conspiracy.com. That's genesis6conspiracy.com. And on the website, I have a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters, and not to worry because you won't have read the whole book. That'll just get your whistle sort of wet for it, in terms of there's so much information in the book that it's one of those things where you need to read it and digest it as you can. And it's going to take a while to read, but a lot of people like to use it as a reference book, and we'll reread it several times because there's just that much information that is in there. So that's where you can find out about the book. And if you do like the book, or if you do like some of the things that I'm talking about tonight, and you're interested in maybe purchasing the book, you can get a signed copy from me by hitting the buy now icon and buying a copy from the author, and I will sign it and ship it out to you. You can also link over to barnesandnoble.com, amazon.com, amazon.ca, and over to Kindle if you want the digital version. So lots of ways to get the book through my site. It's also available through most websites. And if I do say I have a document or something, or you want to ask me a question, there's a contact the author button on there as well. And I do apologize for not getting back to people as quickly as I would like to get back to them. But I spend a lot of time every day on social media. I just run a couple of weeks behind at times on keeping up with all of the incoming requests for information and things. But so I'm not ignoring you. I will get back to you if you get a hold of me. So that's the best way to get a hold of me, and to find out more about my book and or where to get the book.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. We are excited to get into the live questions. So without further ado, let's jump in here to the first question that comes from Patrick Lewis. And they ask, What was the name of Cain and Abel's twin sisters, and how many children did they bear to Cain?
Yeah, I looked at that, and that's a very, very interesting question. And I think what I'll do is, in terms of answering it, I'll sort of try and answer a little bit about what Patrick is asking from outside the Bible, and then sort of come back to the Bible. So, and my approach is I like to read things outside the Bible, and I look for additional information if it runs consistent with Scripture, and additional context if it runs consistent with Scripture. But where it strays, I may still find it interesting, but I probably may not use it in terms of what I'm writing or what I'm communicating to people about. So Cain and Abel and their twin sisters is one of those sort of subjects. And so where that tradition comes from the best that I was ever able to discover, and I didn't go too far down the rabbit hole on this one, but I think where it came from what I was looking at is that it was designed to sort of explain this concept of having the twin sisters. It was designed to explain where the wives would have come from for Cain in particular. So, because Abel obviously is going to be killed by Cain, and how he's able to find a wife. And so we get a couple of interesting traditions as to the main sort of theme of this. There are other branches, but the two main ones are Eastern Orthodox in terms of their understanding, and Jewish mystical tradition for the most part, and particularly out of some of the legends of the Bible, or from the Jewish Siddur Hadorat. So Cain is thought to have had a twin sister by several different names, because there's a lot of different traditions here. So I'll cite a few of them. Almana, Azran, and Azura, which is very interesting as you get into Zoroastrianism and Ahura Mazda and names that are similar to that. I don't think there's a connection there, but I was looking at that saying there's some phonetic connections there. Also, Lucia Kainan, which is the same spelling as Kainan or Canaan, as is listed in the Patriarchs of the Bible. And another one that's really kind of interesting is Lulawa, and that typically is the compound first part of the name to a Jewish mystical tradition that comes out of Babylon and out of their exile in Babylon, where Lilith was a consort in that tradition of Adam and produced Cain, and that Lula was also a daughter of Lilith as well, not necessarily by Adam, but by some other outside source, fallen angel, whatever, and that the name of Cain's wife in a lot of occult traditions and genealogies was Lula Lilith. So it seems to have sort of some connections into there. But that's kind of the names of the twin sister that comes out of the Bible in the Eastern Orthodox tradition and in the Jewish tradition. In the Abel one, and of course, we don't know how long he lived, not long, unfortunately, before Cain kills him, because seemingly these are part of very close to, if not being the first offerings as a young adult to God when this whole dispute sort of comes about. So he has a name of twin sister's name of Balbira in Jewish tradition, or Aklima. Sometimes that's attributed to Cain's twin sister's name in that tradition, but typically more often it's as I understand it, it's is thought to be Abel's twin sister. And so we also get, traditions that come out of the Qur'an as well that would indicate that Abel and, well, I shouldn't say out of the Quran. It's not in the Quran. It comes out of the Hadith. I should be accurate on that. But and it's sort of an Islamic sort of tradition that they also had twin sisters. So I want to be careful. I don't make errors that way without connecting the dots. And I do to make a distinction between the Qur'an and the various hadiths of the different sects. So, but we don't get the names of Cain and Abel's twin sisters in the Bible. And that's because I'm not convinced that they actually did have twin sisters. And I think this was, as I said, a tradition that was created to sort of explain away where the wife would have come from for Cain after he was sentenced and ostracized away and he went to the land of Nod in the east. So if we look at what happens in the book of Genesis, and particularly in Genesis 5:3. And so if you go back also to what I had said just a few minutes ago about the time of where the hard feelings come from at the time of the offerings by Abel and Cain, where God is going to favor Abel's offering in the spirit that he does it and in the legality of offering those first fruits, then you'll start to understand that was very early into adulthood. This will start to make some sense that there's a gap between when other offspring are created, or I mean, not created, but are born to Adam and Eve. So in Genesis 5:3, Adam is 130 years old when Seth is born. And then in Genesis 5:4, it says, after Seth, then Adam and Eve begat sons and daughters. So we don't get a mention of them before that, and we don't even get a mention of daughters until Adam is 130 years old. And again, we don't know how long Adam was in Eden, but there seems to be a gap in here before Seth is born outside of Eden. And then sometime later, the daughters are born, which really makes you sort of understand why there's a tradition to explain away these where Cain received a wife, because you have that gap, and it seems that there's no way he could have found a wife unless the Bible is in contradiction, which I don't think so. What I do think is happening is that the day 6 creation of humans and the Eden account are distinctly different in terms of the order of the creation, in terms of all the different details that are different. And so they are so divergent in terms of what's going on. They are either the Bible is in contradiction, is where you sort of get left with, or there's a different creation. First of the people of day 6, and then sometime after day 7. We don't know again how long after. A lot of people superimpose day 8, but sometime after, you would have Adam being created for a very, very special purpose, and to be the resolution, so to speak, for the angelic rebellion. But that's another story in itself. So that's the information that I have on where the tradition comes from for the names. It's not biblical as that we can substantiate it. And it would seem to run contrary to the details provided for the birth of the daughters to Adam and Eve.
Awesome. Thank you very much for all of that great information. Move on to the next question. And before we do, actually, I just want to remind everybody that is joining over in the YouTube live stream that we are taking down questions for the live questions tonight after the pre-made list is done. So if you do have a question, please type in all caps question or tag me in the chat, and I'll make sure that your question gets on there for the live questions tonight. And if we do not get to your question, it will roll over to next month's pre-made list. So let's continue on. This next question comes from Facts Not Fiction, and they say a lot of evidence points that we are close to the tribulation period, and every generation says this, but I think there's a good chance this may not come anytime soon. Do you agree or disagree, and why?
Well, I might be a little bit more in between where Facts Not Fiction is. I think there is a lot of evidence that we're close to the tribulation period, and that we ought not to look for it for tomorrow type of thing. So I would maybe be a little bit more in the middle in terms of how Facts Not Fiction has posed the question. So let me explain how I get there and what I kind of look for in terms of timing and things like that. So I think the first thing we need to understand in terms of when the tribulation will happen, and understand that tribulation is not the wrath. That's the year of the Lord's wrath. That's a different time frame in the last 7 years, and it's labeled, titled, worded differently than the tribulation. It has maybe similar catastrophes, but when it happens, the various tribulations, and I think there's more than one, is separate from when the wrath happens. But certainly you have a tribulation that's going to lead into the wrath bowls in the last 3.5 years. So let's sort of get into how I get there then. So you have three basically what I call overarching signs that guide you in terms of the sequence of the events that are happening in the oration that Jesus provides for the end time. And he's going to actually talk about the tribulation in his oration. He's actually going to talk about 2 tribulations in the oration, and then I'll talk about a possible third as well. And in there, we know we're getting a sequence of events because he uses the word "the" as it's used several times throughout the book of Matthew. And that's the Greek word "tot," which means then, at that time, when. And so you're getting that word used as he's laying out the sequences of events. So we know it's linear, and we're getting the sequence, and we also get the midpoint timing in terms of the abomination, where he refers us back to the prophecies of Daniel that talks about the various abominations timing at the midpoint of the last 7 years, Daniel 9:27, Daniel 9:11, Daniel 9:12, and I think there's one other one too in there, but it doesn't matter. You get sort of the idea on that. So when we look at what's going on here with these overarching signs, we get 3. And birth pangs comes first in Matthew 24:8-9, and it's the beginning of sorrows, where catastrophes are going to start to get stronger. And so one should expect tribulations to start to get stronger in the end times, and I'll come back to that. And then the second one that we get follows the sequence of events that Jesus provides for us, and that's the fig tree generation. So what we get from that is that there is a generation that this will all be taking place, the sequence of events that he provides, and that, heaven and earth will go away, but his words will never go away. So there's a specific generation. He is being very assertive on this, that we should take this for an understanding, and it's called the fig tree generation. And the fig tree generation, from my research shows, is representing the tribe of the 3 tribes of the southern kingdom known as Judah and Judea, who were dispersed by the Romans in 70 AD with the fall of Jerusalem. And when that fig tree grows back, and I think we had a foreshadow of what Jesus is doing while he was there when he kills the fig tree, after taking a piece of fruit of it. And then after that, you start to get sort of some of the prophetic things coming from Jesus for the end time. But he puts it all together for us in the oration in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, Luke 21. So there's a generation. What we don't know is how long that generation is. It could be 40 years as the book of Exodus describes it. It could be 70 years as the book of Psalms describes it. Or it could be even 120 years as Genesis 6:3 in the Nephilim narrative describes a generation or a lifetime being reduced to for the crimes of the creation of the Nephilim. And then we also have the days of Noah, so that it should be like the days of Noah in terms of the technology and the godlessness and the violence and the things like that. So we need to learn about the days of Noah on both sides of the flood, because he lived 600 years before the flood, 350 years after the flood. So we need to understand the days of Noah. Those are the 3 overarching signs, but it's that fig tree generation. And I think we're in the fig tree generation because essentially all prophecy centers around, end time prophecy centers around the southern kingdom of Judah. Yes, lost Israel will awaken in the last 7 years, and we do have specific prophecies, but where I'm getting at is it's Judea and in control of Jerusalem, which happens in 1967. So if I were to speculate and say where I think the fig tree generation begins would be in 1967. And then that would start with the birth pangs or the beginning of sorrows, where the events of pestilence and pandemic, or pestilence and famine and earthquakes and wars and rumors of wars are going to get stronger as they go out through this generation, and will continue until everything would be destroyed, except for the fact that Jesus steps in. So we need to factor that in, as well as the persecutions that is going to go on in the end time are going to get stronger as we go through the generation. And so we need to look at that as part of the sorrows. And so if we start to understand that, and that if we are in the fig tree generation, and I think they are, we ought to expect that we should be seeing tribulation. And we are. We're just not seeing severe tribulation at this point in time. What's interesting is Revelation 2, 9, and 10 talks about 10 days of tribulation. So that's more than the last 7 years. And that would suggest 3 years before the last 7, if a day is a year, just as Revelation overlays on to Daniel very, very well, and that's a week of years. And all of the math of the days and all of the descriptions matches up perfectly. That's written in Revelation as it matches up with Daniel. So it makes sense then that they might use that days as a day of a week, as a year would be 10 years of tribulation. So tribulation is used 17 times in the Old Testament, and that's the Greek word Philippi's, and it's number 2347. But it doesn't always get translated as tribulation. And so it can be a little bit confusing in terms of how the translators had decided to translate that. And I'll give an example here in a second. But what we do understand from some of the applications of Philippi's tribulation in the New Testament, as an example in Acts 14:22, it says that all Christians must go through tribulation to enter the kingdom of God. So even if we weren't in the end time, we ought to expect that we should have tribulation. So it really gets to be sort of a degree that you would build upon in terms of that sort of baseline platform, that tribulation is part of being a Christian and part of giving the testimony for Jesus and part of believing in God and testifying to God and all the great things that he has done. And then we move on to Romans 8:35 through 39. We're essentially said that we're going to have, we should be expecting, if we're going to have tribulation, as in Acts talks about, that we could look to the tribulations that happened to the early Christians, which is exactly what is being described in the end time tribulations. And so we should expect that escalation to that sort of point. And we actually get tribulation coming up in the book of Revelation, in Revelation 7:14. And in there, that's the tribulation of the saints. And this is in the first 3.5 years of the last 7. So we'll have tribulation before that is brutal, as with rising Babylon. Babylon comes to power at about the start of the last 7 years. This is really going to ramp up into genocide. So we should continue, as I say, to expect this continual ramping up of tribulation. And then in Mark 24:8-9, you have Jesus describing saints being afflicted. And that word afflicted goes back to the Greek word Philippi's, which they could have just as easily as translated as tribulation and been a little bit more consistent in terms of the translation. And then in Matthew 24:21, after the abomination, in the second half, you have another tribulation, and that's the great tribulation of the world. So Revelation 7:14 is representing the first fruits who are martyred for the testimony of Jesus, just as those were martyred in Revelation 6. And they come out of the great tribulation of the saints, which is that period that happens before the abomination that Matthew describes in starting in 24:8-9. And then in what's really interesting is in Mark 13:19, as it gives a parallel accounting of the tribulation of the world not seen since the creation of the world, which is leading into the wrath bowls at the last year of the last 7 years, in the year of the Lord's wrath. The translators don't use tribulation there. They use the word affliction, but it goes back to the Greek word Philippes. So to get back now to facts, not fiction's question is, we are seeing tribulation. We ought to expect that to continue to ramp up. It's going to continue, and it may not come into the tribulation that we have of the saints, that is in the last 3.5 years, for a few more years, but I don't think it's that far away. I don't know how long, again, depending on whether or not it's 70 or 120 years from 1967, based on if Jerusalem being captured by Judah is the start to the fig tree generation, which sort of the allegory and the details tend to sort of point towards in terms of my research. But again, we do want to be careful because we don't know exactly when that is, but we have to start putting the signs together. And I think for the first time, all the signs are coming together. But we ought not to think that the seals have been opened yet, and we ought not to jump ahead of end-time chronology. We have not seen Babylon rise. We have not seen the world empire come together, but I think we're seeing the catastrophes of pestilence. I think we're seeing the catastrophes of wars and rumors of war starting to shape up, that we'll be working with the other catastrophes to cattle herd the world into the open arms of the globalists and the 10-king nation. And I think what we're seeing that's going on in Kiev and Russia is part of that beginning of sorrows, of wars and rumors of war and shuffling for position.
Very well put there. Thank you so much for the thorough information. Move on to the next question that comes from Winter St. Clair. Have you heard of Jonathan Kleck and the idea he puts forth that the Elohim, parentheses, fallen ones, in Genesis created man in their image, and that we are the fallen angels who chose to come to earth and can be redeemed back to God through the Messiah?
You know, I'm familiar with Mr. Kleck's name. I'm not familiar with his work. I am a little bit familiar with this idea that is being mentioned by Winter, and so based on that, I think I can address it. But I can't get into all the details of what Jonathan might have put into this because I don't know those details. But I think the concept there is a very interesting concept. And it's interesting to think about. When I think about it, though, again, I need to, in my approach, I like to have things not be in conflict. So I don't like the Bible to be in conflict whatsoever. So we got a few things that are in the passage here. So before I get into whether or not we're the spirits of fallen angels in a second chance sort of understanding, is let's understand that in my understanding is I do not believe Genesis 1 is talking about the fallen ones in terms of the creation of man in their image. And how I get there is if I look at the words where it says, which I think is a poor translation again, in Genesis 1:26. It says, "Let us." And if you want to understand that as the Trinity, um, I understand that inserting, but there's no Hebrew words there. And the translators a lot of times will insert words that aren't there to try and help sort of connect the dots on what's being communicated from the original Hebrew. And it says, "Let us make man in our own image." And we also get in Genesis 1 that same sort of wording about God making us in his image. Again, that pops up in Genesis 1. So understand then, to get a good understanding, then we probably need to look at what the words are being translated out of Hebrew for, and what the meaning is. So the word God, that is derived from the Hebrew word Elohim, is merely sort of two simple kind of meanings. One is it's the plural of El, or the plural of an angel, or a plural of a god, which Jonathan would be referring to if Winter's information is accurate here. But others refer to that, so within that concept. So you could translate that as angels. But I'm not convinced you could necessarily translate that without inference and overlaying sort of an interpretation or opinion that it would be the fallen angels, as in the Nephilim. But one could translate that as angels. There's no doubt about that. The other meaning for it, and depending on how it's used, and in English, we denote that with a capital E, for a superlative naming of the God Most High, as Elohim, as one of ways of his name is sort of translated, or his being is being translated. And so you get down to making a choice there. Is that the fallen angels who created all things? Well, we're told in the New Testament, both in I won't go through all of the passages, but certainly in the book of John, and is probably the most clearest exception, where the Word created all things at the command of God. And so it's not the fallen angels that created the creation or the humans. It would have been the Word of God, just as we get in Ephesians that that God and the Word does the creation, has basically chosen us since the foundation of the world. So, and that our names are written in the book before the creation of the world. And it's up to us not to have them rubbed out. And so if we're going to look at that in the plural aspect and not contradicting what happens in the Bible, then the plural, if one wants it as "let us," as the translators of the King James put in, then that would include God, the Word, which we know both were involved. God commands, Jesus created before he was flesh as the Word, and the Spirit, which was hovering over the earth, described in Genesis 1:2, is going to provide the life for the creations that are within all of the creation that is created by the Word. So you could use that as the plural as well. And probably that's what the whole concept is trying to transmit. And so we're created in the image of God, the Holy Spirit, and the Word, as if you want to use that in that plural sense. And I think that would be accurate. And you have the word image, which is a word that comes from an unused root, and it can be translated as image, and also a shade, a phantom, or a spirit. So what you sort of get from an understanding about this is, in heaven you have the Word that was Spirit, the Holy Spirit that was Spirit, and God who is Spirit, and all who dwell there are the spirits. So the image is going to be in the image of the spirit out of heaven that's created by God and implemented through the Holy Spirit. So I think all things are pointing towards that it's not angels that would have created humankind, but in that creation, although it is a different type of creation than what is Adam, I think, in the Eden account, but that's another rabbit hole we won't go down now, is indicating that we're not created by fallen angels. Now, to get to the next part is, are we then to be, are we then fallen angels who have like a second chance to be and thus to be redeemed back that way and sort of answer the angelic rebellion? And so when I look at that, I'm going, okay, all names were written in the book of life before creation, and then you have the angels created, and then you have creation. And so that would include then all the names of the fallen angels and all the names of humankind. And the fallen angels were created first, and by their actions and their rebellion and their continued rebellion, you would have your name sort of rubbed out from the book of life, just as humans have that choice to rub our names out as well. So we have to make a choice for Jesus and a choice for God, which the fallen angels haven't done yet, that I can tell, to not have our names be removed from the book of life. And in Hebrews 9:27, we're told humans die once and then the judgment. And so angels don't die. They're immortal. And angels are going to go to the lake of fire at the end of the end time, and then Satan 1,000 years later. And we know that they are going there forever because Matthew 25:41 tells us that they are going to the lake of fire reserved for the fallen angels. We're going to have a series of resurrections to make ourselves like angels, even though we have human fathers. So again, you get the language in there that says we're not angels. We can choose to become like angels, even though we're created differently than the fallen angels, because we have human parents. And because we have a human father, we're not exactly like sons of God. We're somehow distinct, but through the resurrection and the promise of the resurrection, we will become like angels. And we'll actually judge those angels who committed crimes against humanity and against creation. So it sounds like, again, two different types of beings that are being discussed here. And that I also think that the Adamites in that next creation, they were created with a special commission to be the resolution to the angelic rebellion. That through little knowledge and faith, we will be raised up, probably even to be higher than angels, because eternity is reserved for us, as the book of Hebrews talks about, and the angels serve us, not in a slave sort of, but you understand there's a bit of a additional promise for how we get about to becoming immortal, because angels were created immortal with the knowledge of God, but many rebelled. And certainly by the time of Revelation 12, a full third of them would be. And if the number 10,000 times 10,000 isn't allegorical, that would be 33 million of them. So lots of them rebelled. So I think as we look at the differences in terms of how we're described and how they're described, you start to get to the point where we're not fallen angels who have come to the earth to be redeemed back through Jesus. We're not given a reincarnation, so to speak, for lack of a better term. That we're created as part of the condemnation to the fallen angels who had intimate knowledge and had already had immortality and chose not to follow God. And so I just think that there's just too many verses in the Bible that just push against this sort of concept. So that's kind of where my thoughts are. I lean that we're two different beings and we will be raised up to be like angels, but not quite identical to them. And so something distinct.
You're really great points. Thank you for clarifying that one. Moving on to the next question that comes from Andrew Findlay. Is there any relationship between the pine cone seen in ancient reliefs and the Christmas pine tree?
Well, I think there are. It's something that is rather interesting to talk about. And I think when Andrew is talking about, and I'm making a presumption here, so hopefully I'm on the right track here, is that he's referring to the beliefs that tend to come out of Sumeria for the most part, that have the Anunnaki angels who are in the sort of ceremonial ritual around this kind of tree of life, as it seems to be understood in polytheism. And they have a bag and they have this crystal or this pine cone type shape. And I actually think it's probably more of a crystal and more of a technology, but it's the connection that Andrew makes in terms of the pine cone shape, and almost like the decoration looks almost like a pine cone when you get a really good look at it. And so when you understand that there's technology of the fallen angels involved here, and you've got a tree of life that is going on here, and you have this symbolism, and all of that symbolism and everything that they show has significant occult meaning, you start to get a sort of a better picture as to what might be going on here. So in the occult, the pine cone is a symbol of enlightenment. It's a symbol, which is the knowledge cult of polytheism. It is a symbol of eternal life or immortality. And again, as you mentioned, if I'm depicting his imagery properly, he's depicting that tree of life picture where this pine cone is almost like trying to be inserted into. And the pine cone in the occult can also mean regeneration, because it's like a seed. It's like a reincarnation. And so if you're to imagine that scene as a ritual, which is part of polytheism, typically they would dip that pine cone or that crystal into that bag, if it's not technology, and it would have some sort of liquid in there, whether it's some sort of water or some sort of oil, and then it would be waved around and sprinkled amongst the people that were there. And so that tends to be kind of the occult sort of meaning, and you start to overlay that on some additional meanings and understanding, it really starts to make some sense. So the evergreen tree, which a pine tree is an evergreen, is a symbol in the occult as immortality because it's always green. So a non-evergreen tree would be their occult meaning, reflecting reincarnation, because every spring it comes back to life. And so that's how they sort of adopt that. And if you're familiar with some of the occult imagery and symbolism, you have a world tree. And a world tree is depicted as a meeting place and a joining of heaven and earth. And it's an actual sort of place in ancientology in terms of where the gods intersected with humankind. And sometimes it was at a mountain. A lot of times it was at a mountain where heaven met earth, like at Nippur. And in other areas where you might take that back biblically, now consider Mount Hermon, because Mount Hermon and Nippur are thought to be the same mountain in a lot of thought in ancientology. Now, there could have been 7 mountains around the world, but in terms of when you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, where it's talking about the cedar forest and the holy mountain, that is Mount Hermon. And what's interesting about Mount Hermon, it was an area that had large forests, and it had strong oak trees and and tall cedar trees that the Amorites are referred to in terms of a giant imagery and a simile to describe that Amorites were larger and probably a little wider than the average Israelite, as being a hybrid Rephaim human being, because their patriarch was Rephaim. And Mount Hermon was also known for their great pine trees as well. And it's also depicted sometimes in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you'll see pine tree, and sometimes you'll see cedar tree, and sometimes you'll see both, depending on the translation that you're reading. So it's all sort of feeding into that same sort of imagery. And then the evergreen tree is used at Christmas in the time of Sol Invictus, that's been overlaid to be the birth of Christ on December 25. And you have this evergreen tree that has all of this occult memory on it, and the pines cones can represent be represented as fertility or seed, which they are, and fruit. And the bulbs can represent the eggs and or the pine cones. And then the last connection, and in fact, the eggs are represent the egg of creation by the mother goddess, or the Leviathan, female Leviathan type creature in polytheism, and or it can also represent eggs of the mother goddess for creating other gods or other beings. And pinecone is also the same shape that is depicted in the occult for the pineal gland. So sort of this pine cone shape at the top of your backbone, that in the occult is the third eye that connects you to the spirit world. So yeah, is there a relationship between the pine cone, between the ancient reliefs and a lot of the imagery of polytheism and the tree of life? Absolutely it is, because they're always trying to offer immortality in that polytheist religion, but an immortality that is in the physical world, because they can never offer the true immortality that can go between the physical world and the spirit world.
Well, thank you very much for that answer as well. So, I skipped between some questions here. I apologize for that. This next question comes from the Comrade General. Was Noah a giant? His tomb in Turkey is 221 feet long, I believe.
Yeah, I've never heard that his tomb is 221 feet long, and I'm not questioning it, Comrade, on this. I've never sort of run across that. But there is a strong, and typically in Azerbaijan is where the tomb is thought to be, but I understand there's a few other locations as well in that region that might claim the same thing. So there's a tradition that Noah was a giant, and that everything before the flood was larger because of the different sort of atmosphere and environment that would have been there before the flood catastrophe. And maybe that was, maybe that wasn't. What I do know, though, is if Noah was a giant, then the giants in Genesis 6:4 would even have to be even bigger. But a lot of people might say, well, in some translations of the book of Enoch, it says, 300 cubits was the size of a giant. That's comes from the Aramaic tradition. I think the word probably should be used as ells, which we don't know how big an ell is. But if it was a cubit, it would be 450 feet. Okay, that makes sense too if you're a fan of Noah being a giant, which I tend not to follow, because Noah's never referred to a giant either before the flood or after the flood. And neither are his descendants referred to as a giant. typically the understanding of Noah being a giant is a Gnostic doctrine. And in Gnostic doctrine and polytheist doctrine, they tend to say the biblical flood story isn't the real one, and epics like the Epic of Gilgamesh that has the flood story in it with Ziusudra or Upnapishtim, depending on which translation you're reading, is the Sumerian Noah, but he's the Nephilim. He's 2/3 God and 1/3 human. So that is either a story to show how the giants in polytheism survived the flood, or it is a corruption of the Genesis account. And so when I look at the Gnostics looking at Noah as being a giant, they also have different variations of it as well, where only Ham is a giant or only the sons are giants. They have many different sort of variations, and they also have in their tradition that either Og or Tubal-Cain were giants and were stowaways on the ark, and that's how they get across the flood as well. So but again, those are all outside the biblical understanding. And I would need something biblically that showed me that Noah was a giant before I would subscribe to that. He's not even described as being, taller than the average sort of human at all. And because I could understand that over time, in generations, maybe the size might get smaller, but we don't get any indication. And yet we get descriptions of giants that the Israelites, who are descendants of Noah through the Shem and the Abraham line, I mean, they're looking up to these giants. Even the Amorites are 7 to 9 feet tall, and the Rephaim are somewhere between 10 and probably 19 feet tall if you look at the size of Gilgamesh as being created after the flood. And he was 11 cubits, and as a royal cubit, that puts him over 19 feet tall. So I don't think you'd have a 221-foot sarcophagus or a tomb for him unless they were putting something else in there. So I don't tend to fall into the understanding that Noah was a giant.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I've heard quite a bit, so thank you very much for that perspective. We have just a few minutes before our mid-show break, so let's get into this next question that I'm sure you could do an entire show on. This comes from Steve Martin. What do you know about the 1000 Giant War? I think this is a show that you've done with my dad before. Maybe Brother Gary's getting a sip of water real quick. But yeah, repeating that question, Steve Martin asked, What do you know about the 1000 Giant War?
Sorry about that. So I was getting a drink of water. So yeah, I did a couple shows with your dad on that. Were 2-hour episodes, and I think he's talking about the Lost Book of King Og, is where that comes from, and it's actually not 1,000 giant war; it's 100,000 giant war, I don't know about the accuracy of this. I don't necessarily dispute it, but the authority of the Lost Book of King Og is in question, and there's a lot of information out there right now that the author may just be writing some fiction or is being translated information that's not. But I'll give you where this information comes from, and it's very interesting reading. I mean, it does talk a lot about giants, and I don't disagree with a lot of the information. I disagree with the prophetic side in the book and a number of other things, but I don't disagree that there would be a war that might have happened going into the flood, because we're told in the book of Enoch in chapters 15 and 16 that the giants are going to destroy until the judgment, right? So until the flood, and probably as spirits even up to the end time. So that it makes sense that they would have had this war of giants. And also it's got Nimrod before the flood in there as well. Now, it's not unusual for people to be named after antediluvian giants, just as Gilgamesh is both shown after the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in the Book of Giants, he's shown as being shown or participating in a meeting about the dreams that are happening about the flood that's coming, and they go to Enoch to see whether or not it could be prevented. So understanding that, here's the supposed sort of history of the lost book of King Og. Is we have a Latin version that was destroyed in about, say 550 CE, and what survives is the Aramaic version, which would suggest you could make that older based on that sort of understanding, and that Pope Pius XII separated the lost book of King Og from the Manichaean book of Giants that's linked and is the Persian sort of influenced coverage of the Enoch book of Giants. So it's very interesting reading, but
All
I think
right.
we need to be careful with it.
Thank you very much for that answer. We will be right back, everyone. As a bookstore for truth seekers, it's our goal to make ancient manuscripts which were once held captive by secretive institutions available for public consideration. In our generation, where wisdom has increased as Daniel the prophet foretold, we have access to many of the testimonies our early church brethren were persecuted for preserving. After being hidden for centuries, these manuscripts have been leaked from various sources throughout the earth, and it's our goal to gather these sources into printable form to make available for all who seek the ancient way. If you're looking to deepen your studies of the biblical narrative, find these ancient manuscripts and more at sacredwordpublishing.com.
Found a little girl, we named her Eliana, and started dreaming of what life would be like with her, where we would take her, what we would teach her, and of course, what we would read to her. One day we walked around a bookstore looking for books we might want for her and found nothing, so we started brainstorming what exactly we would want. Even from a young age, we wanted her to know and understand the heart of God, and hidden truths that are in ancient biblical manuscripts like the Book of Enoch, and the idea of the Prophecy for Children series was born. Justin got hard to work, and praise Yah released the Prophecy for Children series. We are grateful for the support and amazing feedback from others who have been wanting the same for their children. We just found out we will be having a son, and we are excited to grow our family and to keep writing books for our children to share with our truth-seeking family. To order these books today, please check out the children's store at sacredwordpublishing.com.
Governments around the world have no other goal than to decimate your entire existence at the hands of the bankers and the elites. The war is coming, and it's your choice to decide if you want to be a warrior or a victim. Denial is not a choice anymore. Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the planet. Not giving up. Revolution Radio. All right, thanks for listening while we take that short break here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. And now we're going to get back to your host.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for your patience. I went through that short break. We just finished off with a great question about the Thousand Giant War, and I'm excited to get into the next question. But before we do so, for everybody that's just now joining in, Brother Gary, would you mind letting them know where they can get a copy of your awesome book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy?
Yeah, the best way to get my book or to get a hold of me is through my website, the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6conspiracy.com. And on the website, there's a generous excerpt, so you get a good feel for whether or not it's the book for you or not. And you can click over to buy from a signed copy from me under Buy Now. And in the Buy Now, you also have options as well to click over and get the Kindle version, or you can click over to barnesandnoble.com and or to amazon.com or amazon.ca. So lots of ways to buy the book there, and lots of ways to pay for it as well, in terms of PayPal up there now and a few other options that I didn't have before. And it's also available on most online bookstores. And if you want to support your local bookstore, it may not be on the shelf, but it's distributed for my publisher through Bookmasters, so you could order it through the store. They could bring it in on a book shipment and support your local bookstore. And also on my website, there's a contact the author. So if you want to ask me a question or get a little bit more information on some of the things we might be talking about, you can get a hold of me through my website as well.
Well, thank you, everybody in the chat who has been doing super chats. Thank you so much for your support, Truth Seeker Believer, and Dave Messenger, and also from Andrew Findlay. We really appreciate all the support. But let's get into the next question that comes from Sevenhead. They said, I'm watching these videos about Enoch or Job building the Great Pyramid at Giza, and they talk about correlating measurements of the miles to the moon and the 365-day calendar. But Enoch had 360-day calendar, and we live on a plane. So what's going on with these measurements at Giza?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And, with all of these questions, they lead into things that people maybe haven't thought about. So one of the interesting things about the pyramids, they're built with sacred geometry that's involved. They have a degree of artisanship and craftsmanship and masonship that we can't do today. They're aligned to astrological and astronomical stars and things like that, in terms of everything that sort of goes in it. And according to the Masons, the ancient Masons, as it comes down through their Polychronicon, is that the knowledge to build the pyramid comes through Enoch, and probably I would say that some of the knowledge that Enoch also inherited from the fallen angels, and that this knowledge was disciplined by Enoch. And this is Enoch, son of Cain, I'm referring to here. And it's important to make the distinction that there's an Enoch, son of Cain, and there's an Enoch, son of in the Sethian line, son of Jared. So you have two Enochs that we need to be always aware of, and both affected the antediluvian world in a significant way, and both wrote scripture. And so it's the Enoch son of Cain is the one that polytheists and Gnostics and secret society members honor as one of their great patriarchs for the knowledge that he developed, that was able to build the pyramid, that was built to honor the pantheon of gods. So everything in it would be done to honor the pantheon of gods. And he was the first creator, Enoch son of Cain, of solar worship. He created the mystical Enochian religion. And according to that legend in the Polychronicon and the legend of Enoch and the legend of the Pillars of Enoch and the Pillars of Lamech, there's a few different versions coming out of the Polychronicon, is that he buried all of his knowledge that was written on 36,525 books. So that's another solar number under the pyramid in 9 volts. And what's also sort of interesting is that, within that astrology that he also invented, you also have the worship of the 7 wandering stars. So that's all part of that sort of Enochian sort of worship. And so the pyramid at Giza has got nothing to do with Enoch that is talked about in First Enoch. It may be more reflective of Enoch that might be in some of the other editions of Enoch, whether it's Second Enoch or Third Enoch or the Book of Giants. But it's certainly not the Enoch of the Bible, because just as the Israelites were on a lunar calendar year that was based around 360 days, so was Enoch and the followers of the Sethian line. But the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Enoch, son of Cain, that goes down to Jubal, Nama, Tubal, Cain, and Lamech, they were solar worshipers and followers of the solar calendar. And so when you read books like the Book of Jubilees, which the Essenes look at as their most treasured piece of scripture, it's a solar book. And one might want to look at that book as being more related to a solar Enoch, which would be Cain, than a lunar Enoch that would be of the Sethian line. So do I find it surprising that the pyramids then are built on a solar-based calendar and days of the week and things like that? No, it would make perfect sense. Whereas if it had come from the knowledge by Enoch, son of Jared, it would be based on a lunar application of the sacred geometry and things like that. But of course, Enoch would never build something like that, because that is kind of what polytheism does. And we're to honor God in very, very simple ways, and without using cut stones and things like that, just as it was handed down to us in the Old Testament laws with Israel. So that would be why you're finding the issue in terms of why is it 365 and not 360. It's not the same Enoch, and Christians need to be aware of where the second Enoch, or the firstborn Enoch, son of Cain, fits in with polytheism as one of their great patriarchs, like Hermes.
That's really interesting. Always a very interesting topic, so thank you for covering that one. Next question comes from Seeker of Truth. This is kind of similar to one we had earlier. They ask, why does it feel like tribulation has already started? Could you please explain or point me in the direction to find the answer? If you want to skip over this one, let me know.
No, I'll take a minute, I think, just to cover it off specifically, in case, because I gave a rather long answer on facts, not fiction's question. I think it's part of the birth pangs, the beginning of sorrows, because the tribulation comes out of those catastrophes and the things that are being done. So as we get further into the fig tree generation that I think that we're in, we're going to suffer ever increasing tribulation, just as we're told within the New Testament that Christians and followers of Jesus and God should expect tribulation. Just a matter how big is that tribulation. But certainly in the last generation, that tribulation is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger as we go, and really gets rolling into genocide on a mass scale in the first 3.5 years, and then again for those who are still here and do not take the mark of the beast and do not worship Satan in the second half. So I think that's why you're seeing if tribulation's already here, get used to it. It's going to be with us.
Yeah, really great points. Thank you for summing that one up. Next question comes from Anna. They ask, I'm wanting to find out a lot more about how ancient King Solomon went off the rails into idolatry and witchcraft. What books do you suggest that they get? I'm about to purchase the Cabinet Gnostic and would like some suggestion for more on Solomon and the Order of the Black Sun, which I've heard he started.
Yeah, interesting stuff for sure. And one of the things that polytheism does, it tries to draft in the great patriarchs and convert them into polytheism, because they look at monotheism as being a religion that has gone rogue. So in their understanding of history is Moses would have been educated in Heliopolis and initiated, which he would have been, and he would have been part of the polytheist religion before he starts on his mission to do the great things that he did for Israel and for all of the people of the world, if you look at it sort of downstream. So, but in the polytheist version, he brings back the polytheist religion of Heliopolis. He doesn't bring back monotheism. They look at that went rogue with the monarchy and is the false religion, and the religion of the Therapeutae that the Essenes worship as well, of taking their beliefs back through the fallen angels, back through Moses, back to Heliopolis is their sort of chain of where their religion comes from. Sort of gets you to how they draft everybody with like King Solomon. So King Solomon, in typical Gnostic secret society legend, is he finds the replanted somehow, some way, and I don't know how it gets there because it doesn't provide that information, of that 36,525 books that I talked about as Enoch, son of Cain. He finds that knowledge when he's building the new temple. And so that's part of how they draft him in, and they look at him as a great black magician. So let's just sort of backtrack quickly on this in terms of where does he go sideways? Well, in 1 Kings 11:3, we're told that he has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of wives that he takes on as he does alliances and things like that. And these are wives from other nations. And so it's through the wives that he starts to worship other gods and starts erecting polytheist sites and things like that. And that's where he sort of goes sideways, is with all of those intermarriages. In other traditions, like in the Qur'an and other places, he has the ability to control demons. I don't necessarily dispute that, because he was given great wisdom and everything from God. He didn't get it through the knowledge that he discovered in the dirt under Jerusalem somehow, some way. I don't buy into the polytheist side of that. And they also look at Solomon as having the wisdom of Egypt, as it's talked about in the Bible. And so again, they're going to make that connection to sort of draft him. And so he is depicted as one of those individuals who Masons are going to, and polytheists are going to direct that in sort of an end time reincarnation, so to speak, with the temple that's going to be established in the end time, where Judah is going to be able to start their sacrifices on a wing or an extremity or an overspreading of the temple for the first 3.5 years, as entrenched by the Daniel 9:27 last 7-year covenant. That's going to be, in the polytheist version, the Solomon temple recreated. And again, so they like draft, as I said, key figures into their religion, even though it's totally, in my opinion and belief, totally false and wrong. And so he's attributed with creating, in the occult tradition, the Order of the Black Sun, as Anna is referring to, which is really, a sort of this opaque sort of order that is hard to get information on, even though there's a very, very strong tradition of that out there in modern sort of writings, and they're getting that information from somewhere. That's going to be coming from the occult. So the black sun is also the symbol that's on the Nazi sun wheel, which is black. That comes out of theosophy, and their version was Ariosophy, Aryan version of theosophy. And the black sun understanding also comes out of alchemy, where you have a blackening of matter and a blackening or a dissolution of the body and its transformation. And so you have all of these sort of different understandings that sort of connects into the mythos that's been created around Solomon, not because it's true, but because they want to draft all of the patriarchs so that they can convince Christians in the end time that the true religion Moses brought back and Solomon worshipped was polytheism. So be careful with this stuff. It's good reading. They'll also, bring in like Hiram out of Tyre, who provided the knowledge of the Dionysian builders to build the temple as part of sort of that mythos. They work very, very hard to get at that. Now, I don't have really good books to offer. You sort of pick up bits of information through some of the occult writings in terms of how they create this mythos. So, and I certainly don't have any books or sources that I have on the Order of the Black Sun, but I wouldn't mind reading some of that as well if I could find it. But I've never been able to find anything that I think is truly worthy of paying much attention to. So, but it's that overall thing that I focus on with Solomon and how they draft him into being a black magician of the highest order of the craft. So they do it in lots of ways.
Really great points. Again, thank you for that information. Next question comes from Stressed RN. There's a prophecy about the children born in the end times who age rapidly, and I can't remember where or what book it's from. I thought it was from Enoch, but I can't find the verses. Do you know where we could find this?
No, I'm not familiar with the prophecy, biblical, Enoch, or apocryphal wise, that would refer to that. The closest thing that that I think comes to it in the book of Enoch are you'll need to make sure you get the longer version, so which is the one that's translated from Giaz as opposed to Aramaic. But chapters 99 and 100 will talk about children, in the end times and being abandoned, but it doesn't get into aging rapidly. So, but if somebody does have some information on that, I would be interested in reading that. I've not come across that, so I would certainly like to scrutinize it, but I can't help Stressed RN as to where that comes from. But maybe she might have been thinking about 99 and chapters 100 in First Enoch.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Thank you for that one. Next question comes from...
Are you familiar with anything like that, Justin?
No, I'm not, actually.
Okay.
Never read that either. Moving on to the next question. It comes from Dee. Genesis 6:4 has always been very hard for me to totally understand. It lets us know that there were giants on the earth then and afterward. Is there anywhere in the Bible that tells us when or if the giants were removed? Also, they were called mighty men, not fallen angels, who were of old, men of renown. Doesn't the word renown mean highly honored and famous?
Yeah, awfully good questions. So let's start with the first one. And so, yes, we do know there were giants before the flood, as in Genesis 6:4 that tells us, and then so many occasions after the flood. And we're neither told how, when they're recreated or how they might survive the flood. But all we do know is they show up after the flood. So in terms of references, in terms of destroying them from the earth, it's more inferred than anything. But you could make also a case that as you're going into that dive, that maybe somehow they did survive the flood. So, um, you know, the earth is being destroyed after the creation of the giants. So the giants are totally connected to the flood story. It's the preamble to the flood story, and the world becomes corrupted and violent. So the word corrupt is shakath, which means destroyed, decay, and that means the whole earth as it's described in Genesis 6 and 7. And that includes, I think, the whole plant genome and the animal DNA and most of the DNA in humankind. That's why there's 8 that are chosen through their lineage and their purity, both of physical nature and I think spiritual nature, to start anew. But what's interesting, though, is that the violence is caused by these giants because they are, as they're described as Nephilim, they are tyrants, they are bullies, and they are giants. And so they're the ones who usurp the kingships. They're the ones who are persecuting humans before the flood. There's wars that are going on continually. And that's the violence that's being created, and they corrupt the whole society. So that's why the flood is coming. So one sort of deduces, God's going to get rid of the root cause, except that they show up after the flood, either through a recreation or survival somehow, some way. And what's interesting in Genesis 6:7, God says he's going to create man and beast who he made, which is kind of very interesting words. And then in 7:4, it talks about God's going to destroy everything God made. And so both sort of point towards the fact that what we only know for sure is God is destroying what he created, which sort of also goes back to, one of those questions earlier in terms of how do we, why I don't believe that fallen angels, created human or anything to do with day 6 unless they were doing things at the behest of the word of God, at the command of God. So when we look at that, one might make a legal argument saying, well, it doesn't say he was going to destroy creations that the fallen angels created. True, but the flood was also wiping out all of these corrupted animals and things. So why not totally? So you start to go around in a bit of circles, but it's not necessarily definitive, is my point, that fallen angels might have somehow helped the giants to survive. So no, we don't get that smoking gun verse that says they were removed. It's kind of implied, but then we're stuck with how do we answer how they show up after the flood. So I don't want to go around too many times on this, and people will need to sort of figure out how they think they show up after the flood. I prefer second incursion, but I can accept on another ark, in the earth, off the earth. If they're here, if they were there, they were there, and the Bible says they were there. So I'm not as concerned, but I do know Rephaim is the post-diluvian term, and Nephilim is the before the flood term. So there seems to be a distinction there. Now, to the name, to the men of renown. So these are hybrid angelic human beings, and so the name Min does fit there. Is because we also know that they were described as giants, which is the word Nephil, and the I am is the male plural. And that's important to understand as we walk through this. So as you take renown back into Hebrew, that's the Hebrew word Shem, 8034. And it means name or reputation or fame, but it doesn't say fame or reputation or name, either good or bad. So it could also, you could interpret that as it could be of reputation or infamy as part of a possibility in that translation. And what's also interesting is that word renown equally goes back to and is the same as 8064. And that's the word Shemaim. And that's the plural of Shema, which means heaven, and Shemaim is the plural as in heavens. And it can also mean, because you have the I am plural, it can mean the heavenly ones, just as you have the terrible giant tyrant ones of the Nephilim. And just as the Rephaim are the giant ones after the flood, with the I am added on to Rapha, just as the Seraph and the Seraphim are the serpent-faced ones, or the six-winged serpent-faced ones. As you sort of get that I am sort of male plural being put on different types of beings. And what's interesting about that is if you connect Nephil, which is the singular word for Nephilim, 5303, it goes back to Nephal, 5307, that a lot of people confuse Nephilim with. It's the root word. It has a basis for the word Nephilim, and it can provide you some of the meaning in the context, but they're separate words. So you have to be careful of that. But what's important about the word Nephal, 5307, it means fall, fell, prostrate. And to fall is typically how it's used. And so they would be as Nephilim, the fallen ones, which would be the Nephilim of the Shemaim, which were the sons of God that were in Genesis 6:4, and that these were, beings who rebelled, and then they created giants in the form of adding to that rebellion to enslave humankind who did horrible things. And so I would translate that as, men of renown, maybe more men of infamy, or reputation of evil, or reputation of being a bully or a tyrant. And so when you put all of the words and the names together, you get a better sort of understanding on that. I might, as a translator, choose a little bit different word than translating Shem into English as renown, knowing that it has a Shemaim as its other significant equal in terms of the name.
Very much for that answer, and thank you everybody that's joining in the chat as well. We've had some really great live questions come through so far, so let's move on. This is going to be the 12th question on the pre-made list. That means we have 3 more questions in total. Let's get started with this one from Brian. It seems that most of the people who made sports games were Masons. Have you ever done any research regarding what games like basketball or the green jacket in golf might mean by any chance, like an underlying meaning?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have not done a lot of research on it, but it is, it may not be well understood, but it is known that much of the modern sports were either invented by or promoted by and made sort of popular through Masonic organizations and working with universities and other organizations to make that happen. So, soccer or football, as it's known in the rest of the world, was basically set down, the rules made up and everything by Masons, and a lot of people believe baseball was done in the same sort of manner. And you get writings in places like part of the globalist secret society movement, and the writings out of the elders of Zion, that they're going to create these sports things, and this is written in the 1800s, to distract people and sort of pacify them and keep their eyes off of what they're doing as they're trying to bring about world government. So there seems to be a connection there, but I've not done a lot of research to be able to fully make what type of sacred numerology that would be put in, but you would look for maybe the numbers of the players with certain numbers. You would look at referee hand signals, like putting the hand straight up is a very common Masonic thing that's done in rituals. You would look at for the names of the teams, although it's not all that consistent, but look for occult names, giant names, things out of Greek mythology, stuff like that. So do I think that there's a lot of Masonic influence in terms of things embedded into it, in terms of the numbers, in terms of the dimensions of the fields and the courts and stuff like that? Yeah, I think so, but I don't have enough, sort of research. I've not done the research, I guess, to make a proper case, but I certainly see connections there.
Yeah, really interesting question. Thank you, Brian, for that one. Next question comes from Aaron. Please explain the involvement or role of such organizations as the Shriners and the Elks Club in the Freemasons and Luciferian plan for the New World Order and enslavement of humanity.
Yeah, good question. And we could do a couple of shows just on the hierarchical organization of secret societies and still kind of skim the surface because there's so many. But if you understand, there's sort of a trunk organization and there's branches that connect into the core organizations, you get a better understanding of how it sort of fits. And then on the branch, you have lower levels that sort of go higher into the beginning of the branch that hooks into the trunk that would be a part of the trunk organization. So Freemasonry would be the lowest on this tree. So imagine it more as a tree than a pyramid, because you'd have to do so many different pyramids. It's crazy you get lost in the types of pyramids. But sort of within the branch and sort of as you come down the tree, you have that linear or descending or upward sort of movement that sort of a pyramid also provides. So if you imagine it that way, then the Freemasons, as being the lowest level, are going to produce the first level of adept. And so that would be known as the third degree in the old York Rite and the old mystical hierarchy. The more modern one that's more popular over in America is the Scottish Rite, which has 33 degrees, where you become first level adept. So if you wanted to be, and then you would be a master mason at that level. And then if you wanted to go higher, you'd have to be like fifth degree to supervise several lodges. And then you go up in the degrees if you're going to be part of the grand lodges and running at that level. And as you move up into the Illuminati and move up into the Rosicrucians, you're getting higher degrees. So if we understand then that Freemasonry is the first level and the lowest one, they would have branches like the Elks Club, Lions Club, you name the very low-level secret society-like organizations would intersect into the trunk at the Freemasonry level, because you're not going to have, adeptship and the same type of initiation and rituals at these lower level clubs as you would have in Freemasonry. But even the lower level Masons, 32 degree and lower or second degree and lower, they don't have all of the true meanings to the allegories and symbols and the true knowledge of an adept until you actually get there. They're still considered mundane and not worthy to be given that information. They would fan out with their people to organize these other low-level organizations, and it sort of gives them the front and the operating capability to work through those groups and to have a good sort of face to the public, and they can do things in behind the scenes. And as you move up, you have, as I say, into the Rosicrucians, and 50% of the Rosicrucians and up are purebloods. And above that, you're going to have the Committee of 300 of pureblood families, the Council of 33, the invisible ones of the 33 families, and then you're going to have the 13 families. This is the Western organization. And now you're going to enter into those groups you would have like the Club of Rome or the Bilderbergers entering into the Committee of 300 Families, for example. So imagine all of these branches around the tree connecting into these organizations. So where does the Shriners now fit in, which is where Aaron is getting at? They typically will call themselves like a 32nd degree Scottish Rite. But yeah, they have to be fabulously wealthy, and you have to apply to get into this group. This is not a non-adept group. But typically, when you're talking about a 32nd degree, you're either talking somebody that's not an adept, or you're talking about somebody who is more connected than what you think. Because not only do you have to be a master mason, which would be 33rd degree and higher, as opposed to this 32nd degree, like the ring that you can order online and get that Shriner ring. You have to sort of understand how this whole sort of thing works within the bloodlines that come from the Rephaim, that come from the Nephilim, that come from the fallen angels that have ruled the society. These are the wealthy ones, and you have to be so wealthy to be a Shriner. And what they're talking about when they're talking about a 32nd degree adept is not that they've come through the normal ranks. These are purebloods born into it, and they're initiated from childhood. They become an adept before they can even take the title. And so because you have to be somewhere in the mid-20s or beyond to become an adept. So they're an adept at 15 or 16 or 18 or whatever level they ascend to that level, because they're taught from childhood. So these are the purebloods. These are the wealthy, and they take that 32nd degree title from, I guess, maybe just a sort of play on words, as that's what they would be called before they became an official recognized adept. And it really makes some sense if you understand that the purebloods are, higher right out of the gate than Freemasons, higher than Illuminati, higher than most, at least half of the Rosicrucians. They come from the purebloods and the very wealthy that run the world. So maybe that sort of helps with that understanding of the hierarchy just by those two examples. And hopefully I've explained that well enough so that you understand.
Excellent. That was a very thorough explanation. We appreciate that. Last question on the pre-made list. Last question before we get into the live questions comes from Sadang. And they ask, looking at the angelic names Michael, Gabriel, and Hillel, Michael and Gabriel have the same Hebrew spelling and ending of the name, in English being El. And looking up Hillel, the Hebrew spelling is totally different. Is it Hel-El or Hallel? Do you know why there's a difference here?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question and very good eye for detail. And in the question that was submitted, Sarang presented the Hebrew letters in terms of what he's talking about. And I know the people out there can't see that. So I'm going to try and explain this in a couple of ways that will make some sense. So first of all, let's just look at the word Hallel, and Sarang, he's got it presented as H-E-L-E-L. That's actually an allegorical derivative of Hallel, which is H-E-Y-L-E-L. And Hallel is in the definition is the allegorical king of Babylon that's talked about in Isaiah 14 and other dual prophecies. Hallel is the word that Lucifer is derived from. Understanding Lucifer is an Italian word put into the English language for a Hebrew word that the translators didn't really know how properly to understand is how the story goes. And so they connected it to a word that's connected to Venus, as sort of understood as the day star, but it's also known as an evening star as well. So for 6 months of the year. So, and the reason why I point that out is that it's important that we understand that when we have a name of an angel, typically you have an EL as it's transliterated into English as the end, as in Gabriel or Michael or Raphael, as in the Apocrypha will tell us, and Uriel. And we get these names and more in books like the Book of Enoch. So why then is in the Hebrew spelling, it is slightly different than Gabriel or Michael with the EL aspect as it's transliterated into English. So the first thing that we sort of need to understand is that Hellel it derives from another word. It's number 1984, and it's spelled Hallel in English, Hallal. And it has the same type of spelling that Hallel does, and in terms of the last two letters. And if Sarang is listening, and I'm sure he understands that Hebrew starts from the right and goes to the left. So the first letter is on the right, and then the last letter is on the left of each of the words. So so you have to look at it sort of in that sort of aspect of it. But Hallel has the same last two letters as Hallel does, with different letters on the front side. And it is not split as how it would be split if it was HE space LEL in Hallel. It is split as you go into Hell with the L, and then you have the identical, which is the AL, and there's no separation in there. And there's no other letter that's inserted in there. Now in Gabriel, you have a G which starts on the right, and then you have the next letter that's a B, and then the next one is an R, and then there's an actual E in there, but there's not an A. But you've got other different things that are going on with the Hebrew letters that are going to help you with the pronunciation and things like that. And then it's going to end with an L. So it technically will give you a format of the E. And in Hebrew, there's a few different formats of the E. And I don't want to get too far into the minutia here. In Hallel, you're going to start with the H, and then you're going to have this like a little apostrophe thing in there. And then you're going to have the two L's that are shown in Hallel are shown in Hallel. And the distinction here is there's no E that's been inserted. So does that mean Hallel is not a name for it? Possibly. But I not, because it does sort of end in terms of how we look at it as an EL or an AL as a transliteration, as Hallel is into English. And that in there, and if you understand that what I said to begin with, that the translators had no idea what this meant in terms of how they were going to translate it. And so, I mean, there is a meaning that's attached to it, like shining and things like that. In ancient Semitic, in ancient Hebrew, there were no vowels. And so this is a word that I think people have struggled with because it's more of an ancient word. And what it is, it's just missing the vowel that's in there in terms of how it would have been formed from its ancient form. Whereas Gabriel, for example, has an E that's put in Michael, but it's also missing a letter in there, but it's got, again, with the letters in terms of how things are pronounced, it's got accents and things like that that go on it. But in the original format, you wouldn't have had that E in there because that's a later sort of addition to the Hebrew language. So my explanation is it's EL with the two L's without an E being in there because the Semitic ancient Semitic way of spelling that would have had just the consonants in there. And because it's an ancient word for Halel in Isaiah 14:12 for Lucifer, that I think that's a carryover in terms of it showing up in its ancient format, and that it still baffles people today as to what it means and how to translate it. I look at it as probably one of the names of Satan. So hopefully I explained that well enough. There's a lot of explaining to do when you have this different type of lettering in ancient Hebrew that the audience can't see. But hopefully I answered it well enough for Sarang.
Definitely appreciate that answer as always. So that brings us to about 10 minutes worth of live questions. So I'm excited to get into this. This is the segment that we call the pop quiz for Brother Gary. And if you do have questions over in the live stream, please feel free to write them in the chat. If we don't get to them tonight, we will carry them over to be the pre-made list for next month's Ask Me Anything with author and researcher Gary Wayne. So here we go. Are you ready for the pop quiz, Brother Gary?
Of course.
All right. This first one comes from Facts Not Fiction. Is it possible Satan has hidden the New Jerusalem location from us and distorted history as the final deception? Thus, we are truly in the millennial reign now for Satan's last stand?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I'm open to all sorts of ideas and things that I don't believe, I mean, you would have to sort of hide all of history. And you would have to figure out a way that Satan would not be thrown into the abyss to make that happen, and that somehow Jesus and God sort of disappeared, and Jesus had already come back and had his millennial rule, but somehow they disappeared. None of the end time events would have happened. So no, I don't think so. No, I wouldn't buy into that. It's an interesting sort of theory and concept to talk about, but again, my approach, and everybody is welcome to their own understanding and approach for sure, but I think you have to include all the passages and they can't conflict.
Definitely great points. Thank you for that clarification. Next question comes from MJM. In general, what are the different ways in which the Bible has been manipulated? And can you give an example of each of these?
Well, I think some of the translations are quite questionable into English. I talked about the Halel. I would look at, things like Easter being put into Acts 12:4 instead of Passover, when clearly the word is Passover in the Greek language. And I don't fall into the standard dogma that the people of Judea after the crucifixion had fallen completely into polytheism, and so they changed the name of the celebration, and that's what they called it, because it mentioned in the verse before in 12:3 that you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so if they had gone polytheism, then they wouldn't be celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and they translated that accurately. So I think things like that are in the Bible are, can be manipulations where they're kind of like some almost like Masonic markers or polytheist markers in there. I think for the most part, the King James Version Bible is fine. I just don't agree with all of the translations, and I think it's there not to change it completely, but to if it has been changed for a purpose, as with a lot of the theory goes by the Freemasons and by Bacon in particular, that it was there to utilize within their own rituals with their own markers that are already in the Bible, and they may use that against us in the end time. So I think we do ought to be aware of it. Originally, you didn't have chapters and verses, so that all of the and if people have sort of wondered why some of the chapters sort of roll into the next chapter, or some of the verses, they have verse numbers coming in when the thought hasn't been completed. I don't think there was um, from a orderly perspective and a narrative perspective, I don't think those were done properly. I think they were inserted. I think they were inserted for good reasons. But again, one suspects that the chapter numbers and the verse numbers are there for, my conclusion would be, because it's done so logically, would be for, polytheist reasons again. So again, it doesn't change it, but in terms of how they interpret the Bible, it might be important. I would look at that as sort of the most significant sort of manipulations. The thing is though, we do have the original Greek and we do have the original Hebrew, so we can always verify it if we want to, sort of take it back and verify it that way. So I'm not real concerned. And also think the other English translations have issues as well. They just have different issues. So, but for the most part, I'm not really concerned about it. But those would be, for me, the largest type of manipulations.
Yeah, really important question. Thank you for touching on that one. Going into the next question, this one comes from AMA Inquirer. One prophecy says 5,500 years from Adam to the Messiah. Which is correct then, that the Messiah returned at 6,000 years? Is it possible that the timeline has been distorted, so we're not quite yet at 6,000 years?
Yeah, again, I those, where those numbers sort of come from don't really line up with what Scripture is talking about. So no, I don't look at that as being necessarily a manipulation, and it wouldn't really matter anyways, because you have 7 weeks that were separated out of the 70 weeks that you have everything destined to fulfill. But at the same time, God is going to fulfill things on his timeline anyways, and he's the Alpha Omega, so he knows how everything goes and everything works. So I think we want to be a little bit careful in terms of looking at some of those things, in terms of trying to get too specific on those numbers. We're also working with calendars that, they have ambiguous starting dates. They're different than the lunar calendar that we've talked about before. So there's just so many different things that have gone into it. But what we do get a sense from a directional basis is we get a sense of how many years since Adam was, based on the lineages and information that we have after the New Testament. So I'm not real concerned about the accuracy of that aspect of it, but I do think we're in the zone for the 6,000 years, and I think we're in the fig tree generation. So, and I know we've answered this question. I think maybe even on the last show where I answered it in detail, but don't really have time to walk through everything on it. But that's sort of the for tonight's show. That's sort of the overview on it, and then I would funnel in other details underneath. But maybe if people go back to the last show, they can get my full response on that.
I definitely, we appreciate all of the insight that you share in all of the shows that we do. So yeah, you can't go back to our April show. It was question number 5 that Brother Gary gives a very thorough answer on that one. So I think that's going to bring us to the end of the show tonight. We have just a few minutes left, and just in case people didn't already hear, Brother Gary, where could they get a copy of your new or your older book, and potentially where they can get a copy of your newer book as well?
Yes, they will be able to get a copy from my new book from that website as well. I am on chapter 63, so I continue to progress. I'm just taking longer than I expect, but that's kind of the way I work. Is I just gotta keep adding more in it. But it's going to be smaller than the first book. But where you can get the first book is on the website Genesis6conspiracy.com, www.genesis6 conspiracy.com. And on that website, there's a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters. You can click on contact the author if you want to ask me a question or get some information. You can also get a signed copy from clicking on the buy now, and I'll ship you a signed copy, and you can switch over and purchase from through the website as well over to barnesandnoble.com, amazon.com, amazon.ca, and also the Kindle version. So those are the best ways to get hold of the book, but you can also get it through most online bookstores and through your local bookstore. They'll probably have to order it in to support your local bookstore. They can get my book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, through Bookmasters, whom it's distributed through by my publisher.
All right, well, that was perfect timing. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you so much for your time, Brother Gary, and may you have a blessed month, and we'll see you next month. Shalom, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Every day, questions arise.
Are the stories in the Bible true?
What if I told you that there are hundreds of confirming witnesses?
which give intricate detail to the stories in the Bible.
Have you ever found yourself deep in the rabbit hole with questions that no one seemed to have the answers to?
Check out swpcalendar.com to see when to join us for our next Ask Me Anything series with author and researcher Gary Wayne, as he sheds light on the mysteries which have us all searching together.